Father Michael Donovan hadn't been called father in 3 years, not since the night he'd walked away from his parish, his vocation, and the God he'd served for 22 years. The loss of faith hadn't come dramatically. No crisis of doctrine, no scandal, no moment of sudden doubt. It had eroded gradually, like coastal stone worn away by relentless waves, until one morning he'd woken and realized the prayers felt hollow, the rituals empty, and the calling that had defined his entire adult life had simply vanished. He'd taken the lighthouse keeper position at Beacon's End because it required no human contact, no explanations, no uncomfortable questions about why a former priest now spent his days maintaining machinery and watching the ocean. The isolation suited his hollowed-out soul. And when the grey wolf appeared during his first week, emerging from fog like something conjured from Celtic legends, Michael welcomed the companionship that asked nothing of him except occasional food and wordless presence. He named the wolf Brendan, after the Irish saint who'd navigated uncharted waters seeking the Isle of the Blessed. It felt appropriate for a creature who'd found a lost priest hiding at the edge of the world. For 2 years, they'd maintained peaceful coexistence. Brendan accompanied Michael on his rounds, slept outside his quarters, and displayed intelligence that often unnerved Michael with its depth. But Brendan had one absolute boundary: he would not descend to the basement. The lighthouse's foundation contained a large storage area where previous keepers had accumulated decades of supplies, equipment, and forgotten belongings. Michael used the space rarely, finding the concrete chamber oppressively cold and the air strangely heavy. But Brendan's reaction went beyond discomfort. When Michael opened the basement door, the wolf would back away, hackles raised, emitting a low whine that sounded almost like grief. Michael dismissed it as animal instinct detecting something, unusual acoustics perhaps, or chemical smells from old paint and fuel, until the night of the storm. Hurricane-force winds had damaged the lighthouse's backup generator, and Michael needed replacement parts stored in the basement. He descended alone, flashlight in hand, expecting routine retrieval. What he found changed everything. Not equipment or supplies, but something that shouldn't exist. Something that challenged every rationalization Michael had constructed to explain away faith, that shattered his comfortable atheism, and forced him to confront the possibility that the prayers he'd abandoned might have been heard all along, by something vast and incomprehensible and undeniably present. Brendan had known. The wolf had sensed what Michael, in his spiritual blindness, couldn't perceive. And when Michael finally emerged from that basement hours later, tears streaming down his face, Brendan was waiting at the top of the stairs, not in fear anymore, but in patient welcome, as if saying, "Finally, finally, you see." What do you think could restore a lost priest's faith? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. Michael Donovan's fall from grace had been witnessed by thousands, not through scandal, but through the sermon he'd never finished. It was Easter Sunday, the church packed beyond capacity, when he'd stood at the pulpit and found himself unable to speak the words written on his notes. He'd looked out at the congregation, farmers and fishermen, young families and elderly widows, people who'd trusted him to guide them spiritually, and felt nothing. "I'm sorry," he'd said into the microphone. "I can't do this anymore." He'd walked out mid-service, leaving the congregation in shocked silence, leaving his assistant priest scrambling to salvage the Mass, leaving behind everything he'd worked toward since entering seminary at 18. The bishop had been sympathetic initially, offering sabbatical, counseling, time to recover from what must surely be burnout. But Michael knew the truth. This wasn't exhaustion. This was extinction. The flame that had sustained him through 2 decades of ministry had simply gone out. His departure devastated the parish. Parishioners sent letters begging him to reconsider, to seek treatment for what they assumed must be depression or crisis of faith. His sister called daily for months, alternating between pleading and anger. His mother, devout to her final breath, had died 6 months after his departure, without understanding why her son had rejected his vocation. Michael tried explaining it once. To a therapist, the bishop insisted he see. It's like waking up one day and realizing you've been speaking a language you never actually understood. The words were there, the grammar was correct, but the meaning, the essential truth those words were supposed to convey, was just empty sound. I don't hate God, I don't blame God, I simply can't find God anywhere when I look. And a priest who can't find God is worse than useless. He's a fraud. The therapist had suggested medication, rest, perspective. Michael had instead applied for the Lighthouse position, using his given name rather than his clerical title, seeking isolation that matched his internal emptiness. Beacon's End. Lighthouse stood on Maine's most remote stretch of coast, accessible only by boat or a treacherous 5-mile hike. Perfect for someone wanting to disappear. The work was straightforward. Maintain the automated beacon, file weather reports, ensure visiting Coast Guard inspectors found everything in order, no souls to tend, no prayers to recite, no crushing weight of others' spiritual needs pressing against his own absence of belief. Brendan had appeared during Michael's second week, materializing from morning fog so thick Michael initially thought he was hallucinating. The wolf was massive, easily 140 pounds, with grey fur silvering to white around the muzzle, suggesting advanced age, though his movements showed no stiffness. He'd approached the lighthouse with purpose, studied Michael with amber eyes that seemed to peer past surface into soul, then simply stayed. Michael researched local wildlife and learned grey wolves were technically extinct in Maine, eliminated by bounties in the early 1900s. Yet here Brendan stood, impossible and undeniable. Michael fed him, named him, found himself talking to the animal during lonely evenings, confessing doubts and losses he couldn't articulate to humans. Brendan listened without judgment, without offering hollow reassurances or theological arguments. It was the most honest relationship Michael had maintained since leaving the priesthood. The wolf's intelligence was extraordinary. He understood complex instructions, anticipated Michael's needs, and displayed problem-solving abilities that bordered on uncanny. When equipment failed, Brendan would alert Michael by leading him to the malfunction. When storms approached, the wolf would become restless hours before weather systems appeared on radar. And when the basement door stood open, Brendan would retreat, whining, refusing to descend no matter how Michael coaxed. "What's down there that scares you?" Michael would ask, but the wolf never answered beyond that mournful whine that sounded almost human in its distress. Michael had ignored the basement for the most part, using it only when absolutely necessary, respecting Brendan's boundary without understanding it. Until the storm. Until necessity forced him down those concrete stairs into darkness. Until he discovered why a wolf who feared nothing else in the world would not set paw in that chamber. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support keeps these powerful stories coming. The hurricane struck without warning, or rather with warning Michael had ignored. He'd grown complacent after 2 years of routine, dismissing the storm track as likely to veer north as they usually did. By the time he realized this one wasn't veering, it was too late to evacuate. The Coast Guard radioed instructions to shelter in place, secure everything possible, and ride it out in the lighthouse's reinforced base. Brendan had known hours before the wind arrived. The wolf paced frantically, whining at Michael, nosing his hand, trying to herd him toward higher ground. Michael had attributed it to animal sensitivity, to barometric pressure, had secured the lighthouse methodically, confident in the structure that had withstood a century of storms. The wind hit at dusk like a physical wall. Rain became horizontal, visibility dropped to zero, and the ocean transformed into something biblical. Waves 30 feet high smashing against the cliff base, spray reaching the lantern room 70 feet up. Michael activated the emergency beacon, checked backup systems, and prepared to wait out the violence. That's when the backup generator failed. Not a simple power loss, but catastrophic failure. Something had sheared inside the housing, metal grinding against metal, the smell of burning insulation filling the air. Michael needed parts from the basement storage, or the lighthouse would go dark, potentially causing ships to founder on the rocks below during the storm's peak. He grabbed his heavy flashlight and approached the basement door. Brendan materialized from the shadows, placing himself between Michael and the entrance, growling, a sound Michael had never heard from the normally gentle wolf. "I have to, boy," Michael said. "There's no choice. Ships are out there. They need the light." Brendan's growl intensified, but when Michael pushed past him and started down the stairs, the wolf didn't follow. Instead, he sat at the top, head thrown back, releasing a howl that cut through the storm's roar, a sound of pure lamentation that raised every hair on Michael's neck. The basement was exactly as Michael remembered. Concrete walls, industrial shelving units, boxes of supplies organized by previous keepers with military precision. His flashlight beams swept across familiar inventory, lubricants, replacement bulbs, tools, fuel cans. He located the generator parts quickly, but as he reached for them, something made him pause. The air felt wrong, not just cold, but heavy, pressurized, as if the room existed at a different atmospheric level than the stairs he'd just descended. And there was a sound beneath the storm's fury, a rhythm almost like breathing, coming from the far corner where shadows pooled deepest. Michael's rationalist mind supplied explanations. Water pipes, wind resonating through foundation cracks, his own pulse pounding in his ears. But his body knew better. His body recognized the sensation of standing in the presence of something other, the same feeling he'd experienced years ago during his first Mass, when he'd believed the Eucharist held genuine divine presence. He approached the corner, flashlight beam cutting through darkness, and found something no previous inventory had mentioned. A door. Not a storage closet or utility access, but a heavy wooden door, clearly ancient, set into the concrete foundation as if the lighthouse had been deliberately built around it. The wood was dark with age, carved with symbols Michael recognized from his seminary studies, crosses and spirals and patterns that predated Christianity, suggesting the door was far older than the 19th century lighthouse. Brendan's howl echoed down the stairs, desperate now, but Michael couldn't stop. His hand reached for the iron handle, his training as a priest supplying prayers he thought he'd forgotten. The Our Father, the Hail Mary, the ancient Latin phrases meant to sanctify and protect. The handle turned, the door opened, and Michael stepped through into a space that shouldn't exist, a chamber that defied physics and theology. In equal measure, a place where his lost faith waited to be reclaimed, not through doctrine or dogma, but through direct, undeniable encounter with the mystery he'd given up believing could be real. Behind him, Brendan's howling stopped. The wolf had done his job, protecting Michael from stumbling unprepared into the sacred. Now the priest would have to find his own way through. Michael's flashlight died the moment he crossed the threshold, plunging him into darkness that lasted only heartbeats before a different light emerged, soft, golden, emanating from no visible source yet filling the chamber completely. It was the quality of light that struck him first, warm without heat, bright without glare, possessing a texture he'd never experienced. It felt like dawn, perpetually breaking, like the first light of creation still unfolding. The chamber was circular, roughly 40 feet in diameter, its walls not concrete but stone, ancient blocks fitted together with such precision that mortar wasn't necessary. The architecture suggested pre-Christian construction, possibly pre-colonial, though Michael's knowledge of such things was limited. What he could recognize were the symbols carved into every surface. Christian crosses, overlaying pagan spirals, overlaying even older marks that might have been the first attempts at writing, as if this space had been sacred to every culture that had encountered it. In the center stood what Michael initially thought was an altar, but looking closer, he realized it was geological. A natural stone formation rising from the bedrock, shaped by water and time into something that resembled a pulpit or throne. And resting on that stone, radiating the golden light, was a single object, a chalice. Michael approached slowly, his legs trembling. The chalice was silver, tarnished by centuries, but unmistakable in its purpose. He'd held thousands of chalices during his years of priesthood, blessed wine in countless services, performed the consecration ritual until it became mechanical. But this chalice felt different even before he touched it. This felt like the origin point, the template all other chalices were modeled after. He reached the stone and saw that the chalice rested in a depression worn into the rock by centuries, perhaps millennia, of hands placing it there. Surrounding it were offerings. Seashells, coins spanning different centuries, small carved figures, handwritten prayers in languages Michael recognized and others he didn't. This was a pilgrimage site, he realized, a destination that people had been seeking across vast stretches of time. Beside the chalice, carved into the stone in Latin, was a single phrase, Fons vitae aeternae, the fountain of eternal life. And below it, English words added more recently, perhaps within the last century, for those who have lost their way. Michael's breath caught. His hands shook as he reached for the chalice, expecting, what? Divine intervention? Angelic voices? The dramatic manifestation of God's presence he'd always intellectually doubted even while teaching others to expect it? What he got was simpler and more profound. The chalice was filled with water, clear, cold water that glowed with the same golden light illuminating the chamber. Michael knew, without being told, that this water came from beneath the lighthouse, from an underground spring that had flowed for thousands of years, that had been recognized as sacred by every people who'd discovered it. He lifted the chalice to his lips, paused, and found himself speaking words he hadn't spoken in 3 years. Lord, I am not worthy to receive you, but only say the word, and my soul shall be healed. The water touched his lips, and Michael tasted something that had no flavor but substance, like drinking light itself, like consuming the essence of hope. It spread through him not as liquid but as certainty, burning away the emptiness that had consumed him since Easter Sunday 3 years ago. This wasn't theology. This wasn't doctrine. This was experience, direct and undeniable. The touch of something vast and loving and utterly beyond human comprehension. Michael fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face, the chalice still in his hands. He wept for the years he'd lost, for the people he'd abandoned, for the mother who died thinking her son had rejected God. But he also wept in gratitude because God, mystery, source, the incomprehensible unity, had never rejected him, had waited patiently in this hidden chamber for Michael to become desperate enough, broken enough, empty enough, to finally receive what couldn't be grasped through intellect alone. The water in the chalice continued to glow, inexhaustible, patient, available to anyone who found their way down the stairs and through the door that opened only for those who had lost everything else. Michael remained in the chamber for hours, though time felt elastic in that space, stretching and compressing in ways that suggested the normal rules of causality didn't fully apply. He prayed, not the rote prayers of his priesthood, but raw, honest conversation with the presence he could finally feel again. He wept, he laughed, he sat in silence that felt more communicative than any sermon he'd ever delivered. Eventually his flashlight flickered back to life, suggesting the chamber's influence extended only so far. He noticed for the first time a wooden chest against the wall, its surface covered in the same multi-layered symbols as the stone walls. Inside he found journals, dozens of them, spanning centuries, written in various hands and languages. The earliest entries he could decipher dated to the 1640s, written by a Jesuit missionary who discovered the spring during his work with indigenous peoples. The priest described how the native tribes had been bringing their sick and dying to this water for generations, how they'd recognized it as a gift from the Creator, and how they'd built the first protection around it, a simple wooden structure to keep it pure. Over centuries, different groups had added to that protection. Colonial settlers built the first stone foundation. Lighthouse keepers in the 1800s had incorporated the chamber into the lighthouse's base, adding the wooden door and keeping the space secret, known only to a select few who understood its significance. Each keeper had added entries to the journals, documenting their own encounters with the sacred water. Michael found a pattern in the testimonies. The water didn't heal everyone who drank it, nor did it perform miraculous cures. What it did was restore hope to those who had lost it, provide clarity to those who were lost, and offer encounter with the divine to those whose faith had died. It was selective in its grace, responding not to worthiness, but to need, not to virtue, but to brokenness. One entry, dated 1887, was written by a keeper named Samuel Whitmore, who'd lost his entire family to disease. "I came to this lighthouse to die, having no purpose left in life. But the water showed me that grief and faith can coexist, that despair is not the opposite of hope, but sometimes the doorway to it. I drank death and found life. I entered seeking an end and found a beginning." Another, from 1943, described a young Coast Guard officer stationed at the lighthouse during World War II, struggling with PTSD from combat. "The water doesn't erase the horrors I witnessed, but it gives me the strength to carry them without being crushed. I can finally sleep without nightmares. I can pray again without feeling hypocritical. Whatever this place is, it's exactly what I needed when I needed it most." Michael found the most recent entry dated 5 years earlier, written by his predecessor, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd served as keeper for 20 years. "To whoever finds this chamber next, you were meant to. The water calls only those who need it, and the wolf guards the threshold to ensure seekers are ready. Don't be afraid. What waits in this chamber isn't judgment but mercy. Drink deeply, stay as long as necessary. And when you emerge, remember that faith is not the absence of doubt. It's the courage to keep seeking truth even when answers do not come easily." Michael added his own entry, documenting his journey from priest to keeper to the broken man who'd stumbled into grace. He wrote about the Easter service he'd abandoned, the void that had consumed him, and the water that had filled it again. He wrote for the next lost soul who would find their way down these stairs, offering the same gift he'd been given: permission to encounter the mystery directly rather than through intermediaries. As he wrote, he understood why Brendan had refused to enter. The wolf knew the chamber was sacred, that it demanded respect, and that Michael needed to face it alone, without animal companionship to buffer the intensity of direct divine encounter. Brendan had been protecting not Michael, but the chamber itself, ensuring it remained what it was meant to be, a threshold between human desperation and holy mercy. When Michael finally emerged from the basement, dawn was breaking despite the storm, having lasted through what should have been an entire night. He'd lost track of time completely in the chamber, but his body felt rested rather than exhausted, renewed rather than depleted. Brendan waited at the top of the stairs exactly where Michael had left him, and when their eyes met, the wolf's tail wagged slowly, approval and recognition. "You knew," Michael said softly. "You've always known what was down there." Brendan stood and moved to Michael's side, pressing his weight against Michael's leg in a gesture of solidarity. Together, they walked outside into the aftermath of the storm. The ocean had calmed to gentle swells, the sky was clearing, and the lighthouse beacon continued its faithful rotation, having never gone dark, despite the generator failure. Michael checked the equipment and found it mysteriously functional, parts he'd never installed somehow in place, the damage he'd witnessed somehow repaired. Over the following days, Michael researched the lighthouse's history more carefully, looking for references to Brendan or wolves like him. He found scattered mentions in keeper journals. The Grey Guardian appeared today, as previous keepers said he would. The wolf watches still, patient as stone, knowing what we cannot. He refuses the chamber, but directs others toward it, serving as threshold and test. Brendan wasn't a normal wolf. Michael had suspected this from the beginning, but now he understood the truth. The creature was something older, perhaps an embodiment of the land's protective spirit, perhaps an angel in animal form, perhaps simply a mystery that didn't require explanation. What mattered was his role: guardian of the sacred, guide to the lost, protector of the threshold between ordinary and holy. Michael began noticing patterns in Brendan's behavior that confirmed this understanding. When visitors approached the lighthouse, tourists, hikers, Coast Guard personnel, the wolf would assess them with that penetrating amber gaze. Most he ignored or tolerated. But occasionally, when someone approached carrying a particular quality of desperation or brokenness, Brendan would become alert. He'd position himself near the basement door, watching the visitor, waiting. Michael learned to recognize the signs. A middle-aged woman who'd lost her daughter to addiction, hiking the coast to process grief, arrived seeking shelter from rain. Brendan led her to the basement door with unmistakable intention. Michael explained about the chamber, about the water, about what waited below. She descended and emerged 3 hours later transformed, grief still present but no longer crushing, able to breathe again around the weight of loss. A young man fleeing charges he hadn't committed, his faith in justice destroyed by false accusations, stumbled upon the lighthouse half dead from exposure. Brendan refused him food until Michael showed him the basement door. The water didn't exonerate him. Justice would still require legal navigation, but it gave him strength to face the battle ahead without drowning in bitterness. A fellow priest, sent by the bishop to check on Michael and perhaps convince him to return to ministry, arrived with ecclesiastical authority and theological arguments. Brendan blocked the basement door completely, refusing access. The priest left frustrated, and Michael understood the chamber wasn't for those who claimed to have all answers. It was for those who'd run out of answers and needed something deeper than doctrine. Brendan's wisdom wasn't human wisdom. It operated on older principles, recognizing need versus want, distinguishing genuine brokenness from entitlement, protecting sacred space from those who would exploit rather than receive. The wolf served as discernment Michael couldn't provide, as gatekeeper to ensure the chamber remained what it was meant to be. Michael stopped thinking of himself as the lighthouse keeper and began understanding his true role: steward of the threshold, guide to the chamber, the human presence required to explain what the wolf instinctually knew. Together, man and wolf formed a partnership that had existed in various forms for centuries. The guardian who couldn't speak, and the keeper who could articulate what the guardian protected. And every evening, when Michael said his prayers, genuine now, flowing from recovered faith, Brendan would lie nearby, eyes half closed, as if the wolf himself was praying in the only language his kind knew: faithful presence, patient watching, and the wisdom to recognize holiness when it appeared. Michael never returned to formal priesthood, though the bishop continued sending letters suggesting he'd been granted full restoration of faculties should he choose to exercise them. Instead, Michael remained at Beacon's End, understanding that his calling had not ended. It had simply relocated to this remote coast where broken souls occasionally washed ashore, seeking what they could not name. He converted part of the lighthouse keeper's quarters into what he privately called a thin place. a space for conversation, prayer and silence that visitors could use without expectation or obligation. He kept tea ready, bread baked fresh, a fire burning in the hearth during cold months. People came seeking the chamber, but many found what they needed in simply talking with a former priest who understood loss of faith because he'd lived it. Word spread quietly through networks Michael never fully understood. Other lighthouse keepers, monastic communities, 12-step programs, grief counselors. There's a place in Maine, people would say. A lighthouse where a priest lives with a wolf. They say if you need it badly enough, you'll find what you're looking for. Tourism increased slightly, though most visitors were tourists only in the technical sense. They were pilgrims, whether they used that language or not. Michael learned to recognize them. The woman who'd lost a child, the veteran carrying trauma, the addict in early recovery, the teenager questioning everything, the elderly person facing mortality, the scholar whose intellectual faith had collapsed under academic scrutiny. Brendan would assess each, and some he'd guide to the basement door, while others he'd simply accompany on walks along the cliff, offering wordless comfort that was its own form of healing. The chamber remained selective. Michael descended regularly to pray there, to maintain the space, to add his own entries to the journals, but he noticed the water responded differently to different seekers. For some, it glowed brilliantly, offering profound encounter that changed their entire trajectory. For others, it remained ordinary water in an ancient chalice, still sacred but less dramatic in its grace. Michael learned not to predict or control the experience. His job was simply to open the door and step aside. His own faith had been transformed by the chamber. It was no longer the neat theological construct he'd been taught in seminary, no longer reducible to doctrine or dogma. It was wilder now, more mysterious, more comfortable with uncertainty and paradox. He couldn't explain the water's properties scientifically. He couldn't prove the chamber's effects would satisfy peer review. But he'd drunk from that chalice and felt the void inside him fill with light, and no amount of skepticism could erase that direct experience. He began writing again, not sermons, but reflections on faith after faith, on belief that survives its own death, on encountering God in unexpected places rather than prescribed sanctuaries. His essays circulated online, finding audiences among other spiritual seekers who'd left traditional religion but couldn't quite abandon the search for meaning. Some wrote asking to visit. Michael always said yes, trusting Brendan to determine who truly needed to descend those concrete stairs. Years passed. Michael aged into his role, grey creeping into his hair, his body adapting to physical labour and coastal weather. Brendan remained unchanged, eternally vigilant, patient as stone, his amber eyes still seeing what Michael couldn't. Whatever the wolf was, aging didn't seem to affect him, suggesting Michael's suspicion about his nature wasn't far wrong. On the 5th anniversary of his discovery, Michael descended to the chamber and found a new chalice beside the old one, silver and gleaming, inscribed with his name and the date he'd first drunk from the original. He understood the symbolism. The sacred water could multiply, could be carried beyond this threshold, could be shared more widely. But when he tried to lift the new chalice, it wouldn't move. The message was clear. The water stayed here, in this place, available only to those desperate enough to seek it. Michael smiled, returned upstairs, and found Brendan waiting. The wolf's tail wagged once, slowly. They walked together to the lantern deck, where the beacon swept its light across dark water, guiding ships safely home. Michael breathed deeply, tasting salt air, and feeling profoundly grateful for the storm that had driven him downstairs. He'd avoided for the wolf who'd protected what he'd needed to find, and for the faith restored not through doctrine, but through drinking light from an ancient chalice in a chamber that shouldn't exist. Some prayers are answered, Some faith is restored, and some lighthouses guide more than ships. They guide lost souls back to the shore they'd abandoned, proving that what's lost can be found if you're willing to descend into the darkness and drink from waters that have waited centuries for your arrival.